Hello, good afternoon to everyone. Today our Ponente Magistral will be Mario Seccareccia. He is now a professor emeritus at the editor of the journal International Journal of Political Economy for many years. We are all appreciative of Mario's decades of work in heterodox economics. And as I'm just sitting down to my computer, I still don't have his full profile, but hopefully with that, Mario, I think maybe we'll be good and we can start the presentation. I think we have about 45 minutes for your talk, and then we'll have 15 minutes or half an hour, depending on the amount of questions that we have once you're all done. So please, the floor.
Okay. Thanks, Wesley. I mean, most appreciated, and thank you for what you did say, which is certainly good enough for me. I'm happy. In fact, I'm very happy also to be with you. Unfortunately, I'm not there in person, so to speak. We're still pretty cold here. If you were to look outside, it's not great. But nicer weather, and as in Mexico, would have been a great time to be there. But admittedly, I'm very happy to be with you. It's only online here on Zoom, and I'm very grateful to Alicia in particular for having invited me to this important seminar, as it's called, or conference, whatever we want to call it here. And I really, what I'm going to talk about is something that is, I'm going to present something that is fairly simple that I would think most people, especially undergraduate students, would understand very well. It's not some sophisticated questions about finance and anything else. It's something a lot similar, really a lot simple that people see that in their macro first or second year even, but in a rather different light, as I'll try to show you, okay? And this whole issue that I will address, in fact, really has cropped up here, has come about because there's been discussion going on. In fact, even just yesterday, I was reading an article from a financial analyst at the Financial Post, which is one of these financial newspapers that we have here. And he was arguing that we had reached full employment, basically. Okay, and we are, clearly, I mean, all that was going on here has to do with all these inflationary pressures that now are taking hold, have to do with that fact, which I think is a lot of nonsense personally, but I'm saying that there's a lot of discussion, and it's driven primarily because of the fact that over the last year approximately, we've been seeing the inflation rate sort of inching up, going up, and we see that not just in Canada, of course, where I will be looking at and studying, as we'll see in a minute. Although we use Canada as an example, in fact, this is something that is, you will find, especially in all the industrial world, you will see a similar phenomena. You'll see it in the United States, you'll see it in Europe, and maybe even in the developing world, so to speak, here to some extent, perhaps differently than here, as we're gonna note. But it has some applicability more generally. And indeed, let me actually, what I should do at this point is to share the screen and go from there, if I could. Okay, okay, how come I don't see it here? Okay, here it is. Okay. Can everybody see that? Wesley, can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I'll speak for everyone and say yes.
Okay, no, just to be sure that I'm there. And let me just squeeze this, actually get this thing down, minimize this. Okay. Now let me just also prepare this better and then we'll get going. Okay. Now, I mean, the title that I gave Alicia, of course, this long title that, God knows if it should be the most appropriate one even, but, it really has to do with this issue again of employment and inflation. And, we haven't talked about this stuff for a while. I mean, when I was a graduate student in the 1970s, for instance, there was debate going on for sure at the time, but things seem to have died down a great deal over the last 40, 50 years. And here we are back again debating this issue. And when I proposed this title to Alicia in January, as you know, policymakers were, debating both here in Canada, but internationally, again, we're debating, about this rising inflation rate. And indeed, many of these financial analysts at the time, and even conservative sort of politicians and others, were all starting to demand that we should go back to some form of austerity, fiscal austerity, because they were blaming the high deficits at the beginning of the pandemic that were somehow causing this. And also the fact that, central banks were, had what we could call rock bottom interest rates there that needed to be somehow, raised again. Now, in fact, I should say that at the time, this is in January, right at the beginning of the year, central bankers were still resisting to raise interest rates because, they believed, and I think correctly you could argue at the time, that this had nothing to do with the high deficits per se or the low interest rates, but rather had to do with these supply type constraints, supply chain problems, et cetera, and that it would be a temporary kind of inflation, quote unquote. However, over the last couple of months now, in both Canada and in the US, what we are witnessing is a complete, almost hysteria, with fears of, accelerating inflation that is fueled supposedly by real interest rates well below their so-called natural levels. And what we must do at this point is not only start to, slash spending, get the deficits under control, but also more importantly, also start raising interest rates. So in fact, we've seen that, in the case of the US in March, March 16, the Fed started to raise the rates, merely 1/4 percentage point. But it's expected, they're doing what sometimes they refer to as forward guidance, quote unquote, here for the markets. And they should be therefore raising now over the next year, until the end of the year, 6 times at least, okay, that rate, bringing it up to at least around 2% or so, and further increases again in 2023. We've seen the same kind of reaction in Canada, where already on March the 2nd, they jacked up interest rates by 0.5 percentage point. And they're planning to do so, again, the same thing as in the Fed in the US over the coming year and into 2023, our so-called forward guidance, as I said earlier. Now, given this kind of inflation hysteria, there's now a kind of specter once again haunting the Western world about rising interest rates. And there's pressure, of course, also to cut public spending. Well, the latter, of course, cannot really happen so much because all governments, at least in the NATO countries, want to raise military spending. The pro kind of austerity mindset seems now in place again for some dramatic U-turn in macroeconomic policies. And especially since the mainstream is now telling us that we've reached full employment. Now in Canada, it's true that we went from way up there to Great Depression rates of unemployment at the beginning of the pandemic, close to 15%. 14%, if I remember correctly, during the first few months of the pandemic where everything closed down almost. But then, of course, we had, it went back down, and now it's less than 6%. And I would argue, as we're going to see in a minute when we're going to look at this stuff, that is not very much, that is still too high. But everybody thinks that now, because there are a lot of job vacancies, that this seems to be suggesting that we're at full employment. Now, the object of my presentation here is to really give you a kind of historical perspective as to why I believe that we're really going to make the same kind of mistake that followed the last time that we went through this kind of exercise in terms of inflation hysteria, going back to the late 1970s and early 1980s. At the time, it led to significant policy changes that brought about, as we're going to see, a long-term stagnation that lasted for over 40 years. All of that in the name of combating inflation. And more importantly, it also led to a dramatic reversal, as we're going to see, in terms of income distribution that favored property earners, if you wish, interest income earners, as well as profit against labor. That also lasted for 4 decades until both the great financial crisis and then, of course, even the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, let me quickly go through what we'll call here the stylized facts here. And I'm going to highlight a lot of this just from this simple graph. I have for you data that was collected for the period from 1946 all the way to 2021. So this is a 75-year period, 3/4 of a century. Actually, inflation data goes back, I could go back to before the First World War, literally. But the problem is with the unemployment data, it's more complicated, and therefore I started in 1946, but I wanted to give you a much longer historical view, because if you don't have that perspective in mind, people get into this hysteria about inflation that really is absurd, as we'll see. Okay. Now, if you look at the various historical experiences here, in the case of Canada, right after the Second War, remember during the Second, well, most of you, probably all of you would not know that during the Second World War, we had price controls. So when they lifted them after the war, of course, what we see is a kind of big jump in the inflation rate. Also, there were a lot of disruptions and a lot of problems in the early post-war period. Remember, they're trying to integrate all these soldiers that were coming from the war, and Canada contributed greatly to the Second World War. And hence, when they came back, I mean, as I said, there were real problems here. But despite all that, we had inflation here jumping about initially, followed by the Korean War period here, right at the beginning of the 1950s here, as we could see. But then what we see after this kind of disruption, the inflation rate kind of just collapsed and stayed down until when? The 1970s. Okay, and guess what? Most of that having to do with both OPEC kind of oil price shock there, as everybody knows, but also, this was a breakdown, as also you would know, of the Bretton Woods system. And there were certain disruptions that were associated essentially with, as we could see here, some very important inflation, period here that lasted until the early 80s. And then, of course, because of the kind of response, these austerity response, both on the monetary and fiscal side, what we see is a collapse in the inflation rate, and it went down and bottomed out in the early 1990s, okay, and stayed down for literally, as we could see here, another 30 years until the pandemic, okay? Now, this is important because, of course, what this figure says here is that after the early post-World War II disruptions, and abstracting from the high inflation, let's say, of the 1970s here, okay, and the so-called disinflation of the early 80s, what we see here is there's almost a continuum from the 1950s and 1960s And also the subsequent to that, from the 1990s onwards, where what we see here is that the inflation rate tended to remain relatively low in normal times, if you wish. Hence, when viewed through long historical lenses, low inflation appears, in fact, to be the norm in an industrial country as Canada. The significant inflationary episodes appear to be exceptions that were all associated primarily with problems to do with supply side, if you wish, disruptions, including the very recent one during the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? On the other hand, there's also to be noticed here a kind of decipherable long-term inverse relation between unemployment and inflation. It would appear that if low growth and high unemployment rates persist long enough, as they did, as we were showing here, as we could see here, you know, in the early post-war years, it was 2-3% unemployment rates. Then there was a recession period here, then back down to 3% and so on here. And then, of course, until the 1970s, things start to go up, and we get this kind of scenario of stagflation there, where we have both rising unemployment and inflation. But then what we could see is that the unemployment rate stayed up and just gently began to decline, but it never went back to the levels of the early post-war years, as we could see here, okay? So it would appear, of course, that if low growth and unemployment rates persist long enough, therefore, okay, and they're not afflicted by what we call supply side shocks and problems of that nature, the inflation rate will decline and remain low, okay, as it did until 2021, when it took a significant upturn, okay? Also important, if we just visualize this, the graph here, there's no simple short-run relation, especially during inflationary periods of significant, you know, turmoil and dislocation, as was the case during the 1940s, during the 1970s, and most recently during the COVID-19 crisis, when during those periods, of course, unemployment and inflation actually appeared to be either unrelated or even positively related, as you could see, let's say, during the 1970s and early 80s, okay? Now, hence, while the long-term pattern is generally one of low inflation, the evolution of unemployment has shown a different long-term kind of pattern historically. What we have seen over the 75-year period in figure 1 here is that outside of the short-run cyclical behaviors in the unemployment rate, okay, the long-term behavior of unemployment displays what I refer to as a ratchet effect. That is a kind of discontinuous jump and stays up there, okay? Especially after the 1970s. Remember, in the 1940s and 50s, yeah, we had very low unemployment rates in Canada. And then it jumped up, stayed up, and pretty much persisted. Now, it declined gently, especially after the global financial crisis, we could see here. But nonetheless, it stayed relatively high compared to the early post-war years, okay? And hence, when unemployment is pressured repeatedly upwards, the economy, at least it appears, tends to get stuck at these higher long-term levels of unemployment, unless there's some kind of almost exogenous positive demand shock that could bring it in some other direction, as it happened, for instance, with the Second World War, as everybody knows, that ended the Great Depression. Otherwise, we could probably have continued along that path, okay? Now, that brings me now to what I would call the kind of academic exercise. You know, we've looked at the so-called stylized facts about inflation and unemployment, at least for Canada. And as I said, I don't think it's specific to Canada here at all, okay? Now, I will look at what I call here the theories, the de-stylized theories that can fit these stylized facts, okay? Now, first thing to mention And as I said, if you look at all these textbooks, even nowadays, there has been actually much discussion in recent times within the mainstream literature on inflation, and specifically on the nature and the shape of the Phillips curve. Now, all of you are familiar, as I said, from literally your first or second year macroeconomics, okay, with the so-called Phillips curve. Now, the old Friedmanite perspective based on the so-called vertical long-run inflation unemployment relation, which really had remained uncontested for almost half a century, has now become empirically discredited and irrelevant, I would say. Even though many within the mainstream have difficulty, especially central bankers, to abandon it. As you know, even nowadays, even though nobody believes in this sort of vertical Phillips curve, central banks still keep saying that in the long run, policies, macroeconomic policies cannot affect in the long run the real economy, quote unquote here, and all will end up being an inflation, which is of course your standard vertical Phillips curve. So in a sense, it's ironic though, as I said, even though there's no evidence of it, as we'll see in a minute, the reality is that they still have a hard time to get rid of that from their heads. However, especially if we look at, since the global, or the great financial crisis, as they call it nowadays, all the evidence points to a relation between unemployment and inflation that, in a sense, stands on its head the Friedmanite view and completely contradicts what until then had been one of the most important pillars of the dominant mainstream, inflation first macroeconomic policy perspective, as I say. In fact, some of the most mainstream of these economists, starting with Olivier Blanchard, for instance, I just give you one reference here to him in 2016, he declared the empirical relation, okay, the kind of breakdown of that so-called Phillips curve as the end of the accelerationist curse of a vertical Phillips curve. And there's been a lot of discussion among mainstream economists over the last decade, literally, which has long been understood by heterodox economists. I just referred to Chrysler and Lavoie in 2005, but we were talking about this literally in the 90s already, about what has been termed a flat Phillips curve or a horizontal Phillips curve, not a vertical Phillips curve, at least for a wide and relevant range of the relation. Hence, instead of a long-run vertical curve around which the short-run inflation and unemployment relations will gravitate, it is actually a horizontal relation, except at the extremities of the Phillips curve. Now, this portrait of a horizontal curve actually resembles much more closely what Keynes and Kalecki had said a long time ago in terms of their analysis of macro price formation. I won't go through that, but there's a whole literature on that, and I referred to a paper that we did on that. Now, if the flat portion of that curve does shift upwards or downwards, and it could, it is because of shocks normally unrelated to demand coming from, let's say, exogenous jumps in the import prices, say, of primary commodities, as it occurred during the 1970s, for instance, or because of some generalized breakdown of the established norms for wage growth that one could argue maybe is happening now. But at least for the time being, this is what we would have called the kind of heterodox post-Keynesian Phillips curve, okay? Now, although the unemployment rate can potentially find itself now situated anywhere within the flat range, actually, I used to refer to this as the dog wagging the tail here, okay? But without a head here, so to speak, here. That looks like the kind of Phillips curve that actually exists in some way. And the norm now, it could be either zero, it could be here, which is what Keynes thought it was, Or it could be, here, which is what we've had over the last 40 years, for instance, in Canada, gravitating around 2% inflation, okay? Now, it's true that if unemployment gets really high, you'll go down towards a deflationary environment even, okay? But the relevant range is here, and it's very broad relative range. It's fairly wide range between U1 and U2, okay? And then, of course, at some point, they'll start to rise and hit these other points, which I'll discuss later, but this we'll call the beverage full employment point. And this will be the one which is the income distribution neutral U star. We'll get to these later, okay? But for the time being, think of it that at some point it's going to start rising. Of course, if we get very low unemployment, you're going to start getting that, okay? Now, guided by misguided theory of a vertical relation, policy authorities tended to steer the economy much closer to U2, in this case, in figure 2 here, okay? Therefore, even though the curve, in a sense, was actually flat, and the economy could have potentially parked itself anywhere along this wide spectrum here, okay, between U1 and U2, okay, without generating higher inflation, it tended to be more in this side of the spectrum here, so to speak, okay, because of this inherent fear that it was unstable in terms of the so-called Friedmanite Phillips curve. So if you believe in that, you don't want to push it very far. But we did see people like Greenspan, for instance, at the time in the US, trying to, already in the 80s and early 90s, was trying to push closer to U1 without seeing any changes in the inflation rate in the case of the US. Now, as a consequence of this belief, okay, Canadian policymakers, but generally, as I said, in the US as well, fell chronically short of actually ever reaching, let's say, U1 here, okay, during that 40-year period, since the late 1970s. Since, of course, the inflation rate had never, in fact, faced any real increase until the pandemic, okay? Now, this macroeconomic policy bias of tolerating high unemployment remain broadly founded on this misguided belief by policymakers during that whole era of the Phillips curve that was somehow vertical in their mind, okay? And certainly not horizontal, as I'm suggesting it is, even though the evidence was clearly there, okay? Now, hence, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the macroeconomic policy authorities in Canada, for instance, pursued very restrictive monetary and fiscal policies whose exclusive purpose was to bring down the inflation rate, even though the evidence that a lower unemployment rate would provoke higher inflation was not there. Now, as was discussed in greater details in a number of my own writings on that, on the fiscal side, for instance, throughout the period before the global financial crisis, the Canadian government pursued very restrictive fiscal policy by targeting both primary and actual federal budgetary surpluses, because of the fears that budget deficits were destabilizing and in the long run, ultimately inflationary in nature. And it is only during and after the global financial crisis that fiscal austerity was abandoned because of what I say there's force majeure, I mean, because of the crisis, okay? And they started to run these mild budget deficits, okay? Which became tolerated, okay, until, of course, the pandemic, when we saw the mother of deficits, where they just completely, let go there and start raising budget deficits immensely in Canada, okay? Now, in much the same way, okay, you find the same thing on the monetary side, where you have restrictive monetary policy of very high real interest rates, which had become the principal central bank instrument to combat the inflation of the 70s and 80s. which kept the unemployment rate also close to U2 there, as we were saying earlier. And this remained so literally until the global, or the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Now, after 2007, short-term real interest rates were sharply cut and persisted within negative range as very low nominal interest rates became the norm. Now, this was so even though the inflation rate remained low and stable at around 2% throughout that post, global financial crisis era until 2021. And despite also the mild decline in the rate of unemployment, which came down somewhat. So you would have thought, well, they're going to start raising interest. They never did, okay? And this is extremely interesting to see to what extent they were contradicting their own kind of vision of what would be inflationary or not. Now, when eventually unemployment rose sharply in 2020, it was because, of course, of the COVID crisis, which, as we know, was associated with both a severe decline here in private consumption spending, but also because of the strict lockdowns there that were imposed, across especially on the non-essential sectors of the economy. On the other hand, the ensuing jump in the inflation rate during 2021 arose primarily because of, as I say earlier here, the associated supply disruptions and breakdowns of the global supply chains that still have not cleared, so to speak, I would argue. Now, the high unemployment that had become a characteristic feature of the pre-pandemic world was therefore not a necessary long-term requirement to preserve low inflation. Since, as we can infer, as I said, from our graph there, the Canadian economy could have been parked historically much closer to U1 without triggering an acceleration of inflation from its 2% norm. Rather, what this long-term neoliberal inflation-first macroeconomic policy did was to keep the economy away from any meaningful full employment goal. Now, to better understand what actually happened, let us analyze the evolution here of unemployment within the labor market framework of the well-known beverage curve, that is to say, by exploring empirically here, the unemployment vacancy relationship. Now, some of you might be familiar with this. It's a very simple relation that—
Hey, Mario?
Yes?
Sorry to interrupt for just a second. We can certainly be flexible with time, but
yes,
the program time,
done.
you have about 10 minutes left, but take 10, 15 minutes.
I will try to speed up here. Okay, now, I'll just say that this unemployment vacancy is a very simple thing. It just says that, if you move along this curve, you'll get cyclical behavior here in the unemployment. So when you have, let's say, growing demand, you have more vacancies and less unemployment and so on, et cetera, okay? And we could call you, now, the important thing is, if the curve shifts in some way, it would be either because of growing frictional or structural unemployment, and also the point, that intersection, the 45-degree line that, remember, that cuts it half here, my graph here, this quadrant, is, of course, the point of what we call beverage full employment, where the number of vacancies equal the number of unemployment. That is just one definition of full employment. There are others, as we'll see in a minute, okay? Now, if we look at that, okay, what we could see here is that actually, let me leave that from it. It shows that at UV is where we have beverage full employment here. But let's look at it empirically, okay? And here what we did was to have, well, actually it was Guillermo there who collected the data for me here for this, for these statistics on vacancies, where we looked at data for Canada from 1951 all the way to 2021 and tried to get an empirical estimate of this relation. I won't get into the detail of how we actually did it, but it's in the paper if anybody would like to read it, okay? And we estimated this UV relationship. And what we could see here, of course, is that this, this curve here, this scatter diagram here, displays the evolution of our vacancy and unemployment indexes over those 7 decades here from 1951 for 70 years, okay, which is quite revealing. One would have expected that the absolute number of vacancies and unemployment, this is an index here, 1966 is 100. Now we explained the paper why we chose that date, okay, but it's not important. It's just, you could argue it's even arbitrary to some extent. And what we could see here, the following, of course, is that if we would have expected a normal, steady growth kind of, path, it would be gently moving upwards, that curve, okay? Instead, what we see is something quite different than that. And there are 3 important observations that I would like to make here with this curve. First, what we see, of course, are these discontinuous jumps in these curves. So you have, in a sense, 2 major jumps here. We have, of course, the first major cluster is right at the bottom here, is, of course, a scattered diagram for about 20 years, okay, from 1951 to 1970, okay. Well, we see, again, we estimated this kind of UV relation here, okay. And then we got a period of turmoil of the 70s. And the last time we ever hit full employment in the beverage sense was in 1974 here, which turns out to be where 200 is equal to 200 approximately, okay? Otherwise, we had a lot of clustering before around full employment in the 60s and 50s, okay? But then it moved away. And we had another clustering for a 40-year period in this case, from 1981 all the way to 2019, okay? And as you can see, we have a different UV relationship, okay? And finally, there's, of course, 2 outliers here, which are during the pandemic here, okay? Now, they're just 2 observations, so we can't, one would not want to generalize, but we see another discontinuous jump here, once again. Now, it's as if what we are seeing here in terms of these distinct UV relations, they represent different stable labor market regimes, okay? Where we have, the early post-war regime here of close to full employment. Then we have this kind of movement, okay, upward shift here into the era of the after the OPEC oil price and all that ensued, and the period of disinflation of the 80s, 90s, and all the way, as I said, to 2019. So another stable sort of relationship. Very important to take note of these kind of regimes there that existed. Second important observation, which is perhaps even more crucial to highlight here, is how dramatically the Canadian economy moved away from the beverage full employment. It's as if the whole thing shifted to the right, and we just moved away from any notion of full employment, as we can see here, okay, after the 1970s. Again, extremely important. It's as if for every new vacancy now, you had more and more unemployed all the time, okay? Now, the third observation that I would like to make, okay, relates to the obvious visible upward shifting of this curve, okay, whereby what we see is not only the shift, these discontinuous jumps, as we were saying earlier, but also the slope is, these are estimated relations for the various scattered data here in these diagrams. And what we notice here is that the actual shape here is changing, where the trade-off, if you wish, between the vacancies and unemployment is getting ever steeper, meaning that it becomes more and more difficult to get unemployment in more and more vacancies. You need greater intensity of demand to do it over time. Now, this, to me, would attest for the fact that what we were seeing are the importance of hysteresis effects here that were dominating as we get further and further away from this full employment scenario that had existed in the early years, okay? And remember, after the 1970s, what we see is a complete shift away, okay, from the anything to do with full employment, okay? Now, I'll jump all this here. I want to say one last thing and then conclude, which has to do with the relationship between long-term unemployment and income distribution, okay? Now, what we have here is that these labor market changes that were triggered, as I said, by macroeconomic policies of austerity, okay, really created damages in our industrial societies because of these obvious hysteresis effects that impact not only in terms of workers' abilities to reintegrate the labor market, but also in terms of being able, firms investing enough so that they would have the capacity to absorb them over time, okay? What we see is a complete disaster on that front as we moved away from this sort of pattern of high, full employment, okay? But it also impacted badly on the functional distribution of income. Now, I'm going to focus on the relationship between labor share, let's say in this case, versus non-labor income, what happened over time. And to get an indicator of that, we're going to look at the relationship between the difference between the movement of real wage, the rate of growth of the real wage, and average labor productivity growth, in this case of the total business sector, for data going back to 1961, but these are the growth rates. So from 1962 to 2019, when the last observation we could find was available. And what we see here is that the early years of the 60s in this case, it's dominated by growing real wage, meaning a growing share of labor. That is to say, where the real wage is growing more quickly than productivity. But after that, as we could see in the 70s, 80s, until literally the financial crisis, okay, what we see is a complete shift away. So we, in essence, what we see is a dramatic shift in the share of labor that was the result of weakening of the bargaining position, if you wish, of labor in the labor market here. And this persisted throughout until the pandemic, literally. Well, actually, we don't have the pandemic here, but this stopped in 2019. But what we know is during the pandemic, of course, in the early period, real wages did grow up relative to productivity because of the complete dramatic fall in productivity. Okay, but now it's going in the other direction where prices are shooting up again relative to wage growth. And indeed, the whole strategy, as we'll see, is that, is for central banks to be playing the role of trying to control wage growth once again, okay, as they did in the 1980s and so on, okay? Now, so I'm going to just jump very quickly here, but just to say that there's a lot of debate around this kind of decoupling, as it's sometimes referred to in the literature, between real wages and productivity growth. And clearly what we see is a complete and dramatic shift in terms of the bargaining position of labor historically over that 40-year period, okay? And indeed, as I referred to some studies here in Canada and so on. Now, I'll just quickly conclude here, okay? It is truly ironic that after such a long-term decoupling, as I say here, of real wages and productivity growth associated with a shrinking share of labor, central bankers today are now even asking workers for a voluntary sacrifice by not demanding pay increases. In fact, this in February last month, the governor of the Bank of England was begging workers not to demand pay increases so that they won't have to raise interest rates to do it, okay? I mean, how more flagrant can you get, okay? Now, this is because, of course, as the economy has slowly recovered, from the worst of the pandemic, this 2% inflation anchor is being contested, by labor unions through collective actions. Just in Canada here, you had a brief strike of railways here, workers, because they were demanding increases over and above the usual norms here, and we're seeing that even on the individual level, which is being referred to as the Great Resignation labor market, in the US, for instance. Okay. Now, policymakers seem to want this new confrontation with labor, thereby, really repeating the same scenario and mistake that they made in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And the way we're seeing it crystallize right now is in the virtual chorus among central bankers now singing what I call the same tune, that one must raise interest rates and return back to some kind of natural level consistent with price stability. And this, of course, especially during the last 2 decades that we have seen of the 20th century, that at the time where we saw such a weakening of the, and the deep squeeze, as we saw at the time, of the share of labor, which they now want us perhaps to return. Okay, so that's, I'll stop here.
Mario, many thanks for the great presentation. I think I do now have your resume synopsis to read out, but let's see if we have time for that. I think that may be the less pressing. Please, if anyone in the audience has, sorry, si alguien en el público tiene preguntas, por favor que me las haga llegar por medio del chat. Si no, voy a proceder con algunos comentarios y preguntas sobre la ponencia magistral. So Mario, while waiting for perhaps some more questions from the audience, I want to give a couple quick comments and a question. First of all, the comments. I think those of us who have followed your work, we have always appreciated your work in sort of hacking away at the methodological roots of public policy. And in this case, this would be the rejection of the Phillips curve, the way that you are highlighting that it, if we want to use it, it'd be much better suited to use the horizontal and not the vertical line, and probably even better, we should use this alternative methodology, which is the beverage curve, and probably looking forward and also to understand the behavior of the economy in the past. I think this is also probably very useful to a phenomenon that a lot of us are seeing today that you briefly mentioned, which is the Great Resignation. And I would certainly be interested in further work, hopefully by you, but by anyone, regarding what's really happening behind that Great Resignation, because it's been trotted out by the international corporate media, all singing the same tune, and it's tough to buy their story at face value. And there's got to be, as you mentioned, there's certainly things behind that, and I think to make those explicit is always a useful exercise. Now, I also wanted to make a long comment, which does have a question in it, but please, no need to answer it, or you can answer it differently or whatever. So another thing that I've always.
Would you like me to mention anything about this Great Resignation, or would you like to perhaps first?
Let me finish, if that's okay, because I suspect that what I'm going to ask may have lesser opportunities for a good response than that first one. So if I could just go through the motions on my questions, and then please
go
answer
ahead.
Whichever one inspires the most interest. So the other thing that I've also very much appreciated about Mario's work on Canada is that A lot of the times when we see, once again, all these people singing the same tunes, they, maybe to abuse that analogy, sometimes they sing the same tune, but in different notes or in different tones or something like that. So it's interesting to see the different ways they sing the same tune. Now, within that, here goes the sort of long question. So here in Mexico, our statistical agency measures unemployment in various ways, or perhaps better said, there are various levels of unemployment. And I think they actually do a pretty good job at the statistical institution of capturing the reality of the labor situation in Mexico. However, it is interesting to see that the Central Bank of Mexico only takes one measure, which is by far the lowest in its formulation of monetary policy. And it's completely absurd to assume that we have the number that they use, which is 3, 4, 5%. And it's absurd to base policy on that. I think especially when we have the much richer panorama presented by our statistical agency. Likewise, we have the Fed, and this is all sort of in the discussion of the black box of central banking. We see what goes in, we see what comes out, but exactly what they're doing to get that result is interesting. So inside that black box in Mexico, we do have, I think, an important part played by the unemployment statistics. In the Fed, I think perhaps the curious part of that is their survey of inflation expectations, which they do give a lot of weight to. They have this on their page, but the survey, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something absurd, like 45 people. And that's going to give us a view of what average everyday Americans think inflation will be, because if I'm surveying 45 people, I think I'm going to give them all the answers. It's only 45 people. It's not very hard to control that survey. So the point is, are we seeing just blatant goal seeking by our monetary authorities? And if we are, what's the purpose of it? What is the alternative policy that they're giving us, but not really telling us? Because the nominal one is that they're fighting unemployment. But why they do this in such curious ways and why they get it wrong consistently in different international central banks is interesting. And I know, Mara, you have your opinion on that, and I'm sort of kind of goading it out of you, but please, you don't have to give any more weight to the second one than the first one. With the Great Resignation. So while we wait for perhaps any other questions from the audience, if we want to go ahead and start with either of those two, whichever ponders.
Okay, I'll start. Well, obviously I'll focus on the second first. If I have time, we'll get to the other, but for sure, I'll try to address whatever I can as intelligently and efficiently as I can here, because obviously I don't have all the answers either. But I do have some opinions there. And first thing to mention here, of course, is that with regards to the, let me start with unemployment. Obviously, the measured unemployment rate, I mean, it's just a number based on the way they are able to classify people, you know, according to certain criteria here. And the question isn't so much whether the scale is this or that as much as it is the direction of things as they go, you know, because otherwise we may have, you know, as you know, in Canada, if we look at it, the case of the prime age male category is a simple example here, you know, let's say 25 to 55, is you're going to have very low unemployment rate, but then you got young people in there that makes it much higher, you know, as a simple example. So we know, depending on how we classify things, in the case of Mexico, I mean, I'm familiar a bit with that because, of course, in fact, I wrote a paper that came out last year in the Journal of Economic Issues, where we see in Mexico, it barely humped up a bit, the unemployment rate, while in the US and Canada, it jumped to almost 15%, you know, unemployment in a matter of months, you know. So we know that something is different here, you know, in the way. and it's not the measurement, we could use the same measure, is because of course there are other things going on which have to do with the way the labor force behaves. One, there's the informal economy, but what's interesting in the case of the informal economy, it was also hit by the crisis in this case, which was not before the situation that existed, if you go back historically for Mexico. Okay, and some of the other countries, let's say in Latin America and elsewhere, okay, of the developing world, where that informal economy tends to play the role of a kind of shock absorber here, okay? But in this scenario of the crisis, it did not as much, I would argue, okay? But still it affects the actual measured unemployment rate. So there are certain features here of, let's say, of a developing world situation that is not the same as we see, let's say, on this side of the fence here, where the informal economy is extremely limited, I could argue. Okay? We sometimes talk about the underground economy, but it has nothing to do with the informal economy, okay? And which are very different animals here, so to speak. Okay. Now, the question though is, what do central banks do? I mean, what are they cooking up here? Obviously, these measures of expectations have nothing to do with expectation. Even, I worked for the trade unions. In fact, I used to be on the executive of our own professors union. So these are very intelligent people who were on this, these are university professors. You would think that they're, let's say fairly well educated and so on. And yet, first of all, they had a hard time even understanding what the price index is, okay? We never looked forward. We always look backward. Okay, in other words, if we, in fact, at our own union, I used to work in the 1970s. First time I took up a job was with the railway unions at the time in Canada. So, and believe me, it was difficult to try to explain what the heck this thing is, this inflation that nobody really understands. We know that prices go up, that businesses raise prices, but then we hear inflation as if it's some kind of thing. It's like coming from above, it's like being hit by an asteroid almost, okay? That then tends to give you these terrible effects on our ability to purchase things that we're all encouraged to buy. And what I'm saying here is that this idea that we could actually have expectations of inflation isn't quite correct. We don't have any crystal ball, even economists don't have it. And it's difficult to ask, some people, my neighbors here, to tell them, what do you think the inflation rate is going to be next year or 2 years from now? God knows, what they would throw at, but they clearly would not have any sense. And what I'm saying here, it's nothing to do with expectations. It has to do with norms that are incorporated in the decisions that workers, let's say, even in the trade union setting, would in fact incorporate. And that's where central banks over the last 30 years with inflation targeting have succeeded in conditioning what they call expectations, but what it is instead, it is this acceptance that 2% is what we should, is the norm now, okay? And that is, and I've written a lot about that, like trying to show in particular how biased that has been, because of course, if you accept that wages should grow by 2% and prices are growing by 2%, you're guaranteed to see your share of the pie here, share of labor going down over time, which is exactly what happened during the inflation targeting era, let's say in our case here in Canada, starting in the 1990s until, as I said, literally today. And so my point here is that that is there to kind of, how should I say, blur things in order to make people think, that there's something called, as if there's some irrational calculation here. There's none of that. Okay, and what we do know only is maybe the pass rate, and often we have to hire, we were economists on our board, but they hired me and the railway unions to even tell them what the inflation rate was in the past, so, and how to interpret it, okay? So in order to formulate their wage demands, that's what I'm saying, is that it impacts them in a certain way. But normally, if you believe in this kind of norm, it becomes, as I argued in my papers, is a kind of incomes policy where you provide guideposts that then people kind of use as an anchor on which they will base their decisions and formulate their wage demands, either individually or collectively, okay, in terms of collective bargaining. And that's the way I think it works out there, okay? But somehow central banks use a different vocabulary to blur things the way I see it, to kind of throw smoke in our face, okay? Rather than provide a substantive understanding of what goes on out there, okay? It's as if all of a sudden our expectations are going up. That's not what happened. And in a sense, it connects with your first question or comment there, which has to do with the Great Resignation. I mean, what has happened over the last 2 years is a dramatic change. Now, will it really mean a big shift? It depends whether these central banks could beat the hell out of workers again. It's just essentially the whole issue here, the way I see it, okay? Over the last 2 years, okay, we've seen, well, obviously we went through that dramatic, lockdowns, like here in Canada, we've gone to more extremes than in Mexico for sure, when it came to the lockdowns, okay? But what we've seen is that over the last year now, as things began to recover somewhat, okay, what we've seen is that workers are beginning to assert a certain kind of autonomy here vis-a-vis what they should be doing here in terms of job prospects, especially when these job vacancies are coming up. Now, if you look at the graph that I had about vacancies and employment, remember the last 2 points, way up in the stratosphere there of my graph, if you wish, okay? The very top one, which was 2021, was very high vacancies, okay? And lower unemployment than the 2021, okay? Now, what that means, of course, is that there are a lot of vacancies out there that are cropping up. But who the hell wants to work in a restaurant and risk your life and catch stuff already at this? So people are being extremely careful about that for very reasonable reasons here, okay? And the whole debate now is, of course, how could we prevent wage inflation? Because that's where the pressures are going to be, and get these workers back into doing these jobs, okay? And that's the dilemma, and central banks are going to be instrumental in that. That's what I'm trying to say right now, okay? And that's why if they, as I said, historically, they beat the hell out of the workers here for 40 years, and they're still telling them now, don't raise your wages, even though they're seeing their wages, like in Canada, wages went up by 3% last year, while the inflation is now over 5%. So we know that they're losing in terms of real wage, okay? Never mind productivity catch up or anything, okay? So you could see the dynamics here.
Thank you very much, Mario. Can we squeeze in just one quick question from the audience? I think the answer may be monosyllabic. It is. Dr. Seccareccia, so in your opinion, can we say that this artificial constructions, such as the NAIRU, must be removed from the elements of monetary policy?
Well, yes.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm just kidding, please.
I agree, but be careful here. There are two notions of what we could call NAIRU here, okay? One notion is the pure neoclassical Friedman notion of it, which was also called the natural rate of unemployment. That natural rate of unemployment is also called the NAIRU in a sense, because it's the inflationary, non-inflationary, accelerated inflation rate of unemployment, okay? However, there's also another type of NAIRU that some more heterodox economists have sometimes fiddled with, okay? And that one instead has to do with labor bargaining position. It has nothing to do with kind of what Friedman talked about, of kind of Walrasian labor market where God knows equilibrium seems to be, exist there, giving you this natural unemployment rate. Rather, it is a result of bargaining strength. If you look at it that way, okay, then that Nehru, remember, I'm not going to go back to it because, which is from my graph with unemployment in Canada. Remember, in Canada, unemployment rates were very low, let's say, relatively speaking, 2-3%, whatever, from the 1950s and 60s. Then it went up during the 70s, and it stayed up pretty much, okay? It went down lightly or mildly, but not very much, okay? And the point is that this, however, would be consistent with this kind of bargaining strength notion of a Nehru, if you wish to call it that, okay? Meaning that inflation became steady at 2%, okay? And the unemployment rate stayed up at, over 6-7%, okay? And that became the new Nehru, we want to call it that. I don't like the term, personally. And I certainly despise the neoclassical vision of it from Friedman, which is completely, how should I say, wrong. But you can perhaps make sense of it, as I said, in the context of a kind of class struggle, almost bargaining strength view of Nehru, okay? In which case, I have less problems with that. Okay.
Many thanks, Mario. We all appreciate your participation here. It's always a very enriching experience for all of us to hear from you. Hopefully the next time we'll be able to do it in person and get you out of the great white north to come to nice sunny Mexico City. But
no problem. You come up here. You're welcome to come here. My house here, so you can come back here anytime.
Sometime in the summer.
But in the summer.
It is snow, no? With the snowstorm. Okay, we will go.
So Mario,
all right. We're used to it.
before I let you go, I'm going to, so we can all go to lunch and be back soon.
Yes, just 1 minute, Wes. Well, thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Mario. Ha sido increíble la plática. Necesitamos invitarte, aunque sea por streaming, por YouTube, por Zoom, porque yo creo que sí sería muy importante esta conferencia que diste, poderla ampliar mucho más, sobre todo para los estudiantes. Vamos a ver los tiempos y bueno, pues nos encantaría que nos volvieras a acompañar y poder seguir discutiendo esto de la política monetaria y bueno, la Nehru y el employment y austerity y bla, bla, bla. Y bueno, le paso el micrófono a Wes para que cierre. Mil gracias.
Les recuerdo a todos que hoy lo esperamos a partir de las 17 horas para la presentación de la revista financiera número especial con trabajos inéditos en español de la doctora Eugenia Correa. Los comentaristas van a ser José Francisco Reyes, de la ENES Unidad León, UNAM, Elizabeth Concha, mi compañera de la UAM Iztapalapa, Diana Vicher, de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales de la UNAM. Y para despedirnos, earmuffs, Mario, I'm going to read your curriculum. Ahí les va la semblanza de Mario para que lo tengan. Mario's professor emeritus at the Department of Economics, University of Ottawa, where he taught from 1978 to 2018 in the fields of macroeconomics, monetary theory, labor economics, history of economic thought, and economic history, subjects on which he has also written extensively. He's published some 125 academic articles in scientific refereed journals or chapters of books and had authored or edited a dozen books. He has also edited or co-edited some 45 special issues of journals. Many of these publications are of an interdisciplinary nature and cover many areas of political economy. He has been visiting professor in a number of universities in France and in Mexico and participates regularly in policy debates in both Europe and North America. Among other activities, since since 2004. He is an editor of the International Journal of Political Economy. In 2017, he was awarded the Senate of Canada Sesquicentennial Medal in recognition of his valuable service to the nation and for the quality of his academic work in the field of heterodox economics and for his intellectual support to the community. In 2021, he received the John Kenneth Galbraith Prize in Economics by the Can you hear me? Oh, for his expense.
Sigue.
Okay, something's happening to my Skype. In 2021, he received the John Kenneth Galbraith Prize in Economics by the Progressive Economics Forum for his extensive contributions to heterodox economic analysis combined with his commitment to social justice that exemplified Galbraith's legacy as a public intellectual and scholar. Mario, many thanks. Gracias a todos.
Thank you.
Reconocimientos muy merecidos por el doctor Seccareccia. Qué bueno que lo pudimos tener con nosotros hoy y muchas gracias por su asistencia a todos y nos vemos en unas horas. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you. Gracias.